Yes. Having worked help desk, it's a valid question. How do I zoom this? Are we ready? All right, I'm starting the timer. All right, well, thank you everybody for hanging around for the closing keynote. My name is Reinhart Geiser. I have spent quite a bit of my life, over half of it, playing with computers, programming. I code for fun. I code for my day job. Well, I manage people, but I also code for my day job. And I have some opinions. For those of you who have seen the IT crowd, there's a help desk guy, and people call, and the first thing he says, have you tried turning it off and on? This phrase bugs me. Yes, you'll also see I do not have slides. Microsoft has trained me to feel very naked and vulnerable right now, so please bear with me. I don't have slides, and I've been trained to believe so, because software has broken humans. We've been trained for things other than our computer that if it stops working, well, just cycle the power. That does not seem like a correct behavior. Yes, banging things with a hammer was cathartic, but is marginally better than turning it off and turning it back on. Can any of us who remember the rotary dial telephone, or even a telephone on the wall, did you ever have to unplug it and plug it back in? Your old Zenith television. Yes, I mean, these are things that we have been trained by software to do. As sysadmins, you're not even free of this. You've been trained that the 0.0 release must be avoided at all costs. Now, I will admit there is a culprit here, and it is my profession as a programmer. We are to blame. But there's reasons. There are reasons. That being said, software is a very, very unique thing. As far as I know in human history, there are very few inventions that have its odd physical properties. It has the authoring of writing a novel. You have to plan your plot, you have to fill in all of the semantics and make it a good story. But unlike a book, once it's done, you can make an infinite number of copies almost instantly. You can design a widget for a factory, but you still have a cost for creating that thing in the factory every time you want to distribute it. Now, software is also interesting because it cannot exist in a vacuum. Yes, you can write code on a piece of paper, but it is very boring unless you have a computer to run it. Now, computers don't run code for fun. We built them that way. We'll get into that later, but we made software that is pretty much bound to a physical device. So now we have a physical device, and we have this ethereal thing that have two very different properties, but somehow are intimately tied together. And that causes a problem. And I'm going to have to go step a little bit back in history because these features broke some things that we've spent a long time building. Copyright law, manufacturing lines, product life cycle. We spent a good part of the Industrial Revolution hammering these things out, making them efficient, having processes. And when computers came along, they were no different. We had these huge monstrosities of vacuum tubes, relays, and a lot of plugs. You would kind of set them up and they would run their task. And this person, Dr. Hopper, said, you know, this is a stupid thing to do. I have this big machine. I should maybe make it easier to configure through something called software. Well, they didn't have a notion of this, so she had to go off and invent the compiler and the linker and the language, and all of a sudden you could take this big monstrosity and make it do a couple different things based on the program. And she gave us some languages, and all was good for a little while, and you know, then we got to do more stuff with computers, and it was doing a lot of, they wanted to make it more flexible, so we had this thing called the operating system, where you could load your programs into and run them. And for a long time, companies would sell you the mainframe, and then they would just kind of give you the source. The operating system was part of it, and anytime you wanted to customize it, you would just take the source for everything, tweak it, and put it in. Software at the time, when you purchased software, you basically purchased the source and made it do what you wanted it to do. But then, you know, this was working for a while, but then, you know, the feds got involved, and they said, in 1969, you can't have your software with the hardware. And every CFO and accountant who now saw the line item that said zero cost got very uncomfortable. So they started to say, let's charge for this. Okay, this is not a problem. We have compilers, I can just sell you the code and you're done. But companies started to realize, to protect their investment, they're going to start just giving out the binaries, because, you know, customers, they don't want to build things, they just want to use it. So as we get further into the 70s and 80s, you have binary-only software being distributed. Fewer and fewer projects are going to be open source. Most of them are university-based. And, you know, about this same time, you have this hobbyist community popping up. Prior to this, computers were monolithic, huge things. We now have these little Heath kits. We had the 8080, we had the Z80. These were starting to make it accessible to, you know, some guy in his basement. This is also another very interesting facet of software, by the way. It is something you can do as a hobby that is also a vocation. I challenge anybody to come up with their own legal framework in their spare time and then try to defend that in a U.S. court of law. I would also postulate that if you do veterinary science in your spare time in your basement, authorities will be involved at some point. We don't have those problems with software. So everybody started programming and tweaking and having fun, and there's this dude, Bill Gates. He was getting a little upset that people were copying his BASIC and sharing it and writing things with it and not paying him. So he wrote an open letter to hobbyists and said, you know, I would really like you to pay me more. And as we know, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, and there's a lot of money to be made in this problem. So we have a lot more companies like Microsoft, IBM, they're all selling their closed source software. You can no longer get access to it even if you purchase it. Again, their argument is, well, you get the source, you can copy it everywhere for free. Coincidentally, during this time, we saw some amusing attempts at DRM and copy protection that were entertaining to get around, but other than that, a miserable failure. So about 1983, this dude, Richard Stallman, he's like, writes a letter saying, hey, closed source is bad, we need to have more open source. And of course, maybe 2 or 3 people noticed. 3 years later, he got a club of people together, and they kind of said the same thing, and nobody really noticed some more. But then finally, in the 90s come along, and you know, I'm thinking the safety dance here, Men Without Hats, for any of you who remember that time of your lives. They finally got stuff. I mean, we had the GNU project, we had Emacs, and at any point now we're going to get heard. I hear it soon. But Emacs is enough an operating system that we're okay with it. And then, like 2 years later, we have Linus comes along with this little hobbyist operating system that, you know, here's the source, and he worked with them to get it under the GPL license. So now all of a sudden we have an operating system. Well, we have a kernel and an operating system, and actually GNU had a lot of stuff, the compiler, libc, really a lot of cool stuff. We had Linux distributions popping up, and again, we're now starting to claw back to the early 80s, late 70s of being able to code for fun on your own without, you know, being held hostage with software. By the time we get to the end of this, the 96, 97, we have the internet. For better or for worse, it came and it did some things. We did get Apache out of it, very, very successful open source project. So we're starting to see some evidence that open source is actually just as viable as a closed source model. You're now seeing Red Hat. I think they're finally incorporated. We're seeing a couple other fits and starts, Signy Corporation, people starting to figure out how to make money in an open source ecosystem. But then we got Silicon Valley with the move fast and break things culture, and that kind of all just went into the weeds. So, I mean, we're here, year 2000, and so far the score we have is, you know, Bill Gates, 402 billion, and the FSF is not that much. Lot few decimal places. So, you know, this is the way it is. We're a closed source world, you know, Linux is there, a bunch of college kids, hobbyists, you know, things are going to be the same. Well, let's fast forward again. You know, stuff happened in the 2000s. Some of us were not proud of it. But in 2017, Boeing released the 737 MAX. The airplanes are very complicated devices. And there are very complicated regulations on how materials operate, on how hydraulic pressures, parts vendors, all sorts of things. But really, when it comes to the software, the FAA has a pretty extensive document on things that need to happen. But at the end of the day, it's taking the company's word for it. So, you know, Boeing went to the FAA and said, you know, for reasons, you know, we'll do the analysis of the software and the testing, and they came back and said, yeah, it's good. Ignoring the fact that a programmer did find a defect in the altitude control feedback, but, management decided we need to get this out. We don't want to ruffle any feathers. We'll just put it in a software upgrade. 3 years, 3 plane crashes later, because, who wants to upgrade their friggin' fleet of planes with software because it's software? They told the FAA, yeah, we found a problem. No one's looking. You're self-policing. It happens. So, yeah, a lot of people died because we wanted to, trade secret, and, that software is too hard for you to understand, so we'll just do it ourselves. As an aside, the FDA, who does your medical devices, your pacemakers, your dosimeters for your insulin medication that will kill you if you get too much or too little, that's all controlled by software, which is guidelines and self-reporting. Unlike the materials that are tested and verified that they are sound, there is no third-party validation. Because all of this source is closed. No one can see in. The people who can see in, the fox is minding the hen house. What's their inspiration? Yes, next quarter's profits, very important. Shareholder value, very important. Airing your dirty laundry probably is not going to facilitate those two, so let's manage that part. It's not working. So, here we are. It is 2023, and, where do we go from here? Is it a coincidence that the less visibility that we have into software, less observable, the more complicated, the less provable, things have gotten bad? We have click-wrap warranties that basically say we're not responsible for our software crashing and destroying your business. We're okay with it. We just turn it off and on and hope it works better next time. So if the trust us, we'll take care of it approach is not working, maybe we can try something else. There's another guy here who made a statement that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. His name's ESR. He has opinions. Some of them, they're opinions. I agree with some, disagree with some. I'm sure I have opinions here that you guys don't agree with, but it is true. The Linux kernel, you're talking millions of lines of code, thousands of developers. I don't even know, kernel.org had some numbers of over 1,000 contributors per release and hundreds of companies. Linux seems to have had some success, and it is GPL. So what if more of these critical systems become open source? So yes, I'm saying, in my opinion, GPL, HEPL, LGPL at all. But at the end of the day, it's a little extreme, so I'll just settle for copyleft. We need more eyes on things. And copyleft has some very, very interesting properties. Let's go back to the novel concept, where we have a written piece of work. In the 1880s, the US government and a couple other, basically the UK, decided that there needed to be a way to protect works of, like, written works, music. Sheet music to performances was another interesting part at that time. We'll kind of ignore that. A few years later, we had film media come into play. So all these countries got together and had something called the Berne Convention. And basically, at the end of the day, it says that every member of this treaty will universally enforce copyright law reciprocally across the countries. At this point, every country in the World Trade Organization participates in this agreement. So copyright, and it's been defended extensively in every court of law of these world trade organizations, and it has teeth. Now, copyleft builds off of copyright. Copyleft basically says, okay, I retain all of the rights and restrictions of this, but I keep that copyright, but I am going to give you the right to make changes and distribute as long as my conditions are reciprocally met. So what that means is I download Apache or Linux off the internet and I make a modification. I can't sell that without providing that source, or ideally as GPL and pushing it in tree. And I will be taken to court and I will lose. I will lose in South Korea. I will lose in the United States. I've lost in Germany. This has been defended in court of law. So this has teeth. And I think it's a very good approach. There's also a little further, there's permissive, which is basically, I retain the copyright, but do as you will. They have varying degrees of permissivity. I will agree these are nice, but at some point you need to draw a line in the sand. Again, we've seen self-policing with closed source, not so successful. We need something with teeth. So I know I say GPL because that's my favorite. That's my stone I will stand on. AGPL now just to deal with Amazon, but copyleft in general is what I'm talking about here. It protects your IP. It keeps bad actors from taking work, deriving it, and not participating in the ecosystem. That's why LGPL at least you can keep open, but in my hippie world, I would love to see it all free. Whatever. A boy can dream. But it will protect your IP. It will make sure everything's covered. I will say, though, that licenses that are popularly pushed by Microsoft and Google and various others, mainly MIT, is probably something that should be avoided. I know GitHub likes to make that your default, I think, maybe still. MIT is bad, and you should feel bad, because you need to make a stand. Keep it open source. MIT basically says, do what you will. I think they even have ones without advertising clause, like Microsoft has one where you can do what you want, just leave them out of it. Because they don't want to be responsible for whatever broken thing they gave you. Open source has that luxury. So yeah, Linux. Let's talk about how they have shown a provable model for how GPL code base can build a valid ecosystem for shareholder value, as well as have reliability. There are a lot of eyes on that project. There have been shenanigans that people have tried to put questionable code in there, defective code, code that could have had a backdoor, and those instances have been squashed. Security vulnerabilities have been reported, but they are addressed. We know about them because we can see what's going on. It's not like something where there's a bug in a buffer overflow in the JPEG decoder of the Windows GDI that gives you equivalent of root access under Windows, and we found it by mistake. How many bad actors, state level or otherwise, knew about that and were using that unbeknownst to the rest of the world? We have some evidence that there may be more of these popping up every day, that various state agencies and hacker agencies have been willfully running rampant in our infrastructures because of. Again, more eyes. And there are company IPOs. You have Red Hat. Love them or hate them, they have successfully made money with Linux. You have Apache Foundation. Yes, it's the Apache license. It's pretty permissive, but it got the internet started. You have Python. You have PHP. You have a lot of foundation technologies here that are open source that we're using already quite successfully. I just think we need to raise the bar up a little bit higher. So we're about halfway through, and I've been spouting a lot of nonsense, hippy-dippy nonsense, and we're probably trying to figure out here, how is this going to work? It's kind of like steering a car. There's two ways to steer the car. One, you take the steering wheel, and that works good for you. Or number two, you just change the road. A lot harder, but more effective. As more of our software gets, Linux and whatnot, starts to gain more visibility, we can start to have that discussion of changing the strategies. I don't think Microsoft is going to open source everything ever, but more companies are open sourcing things. ZFS, license choice is dubious, but I think with encouragement from organizations such as the FSF, these copyleft licenses can be recommended for products that become open source in nature. I'll put in a plug. I'm a guilty member. I'm not a member of the FSF, but I play one on TV. I would encourage you to help them because they do go to court. There are other organizations that also have gone to court on behalf of these open source licenses. So that's one way we can change the road. I think business owners, those of you who maintain closed source software or sell closed source software, I would ask yourself, what benefit do you gain by not having that source publicly available? Shame, unfortunately, is a common response, but there are arguments for security, but a lot of open source projects have very responsible security disclosure policies. If you look at many of the very newer and successful ones, they have testing, they have pull request requirements, they have community engagement guidelines. They, in some ways, I think, run a better software shop than some closed source shops. So I think as a business owner, you can ask yourself, what am I gaining by not sharing it? Likewise, what would I be losing? Yes, your product may not have enough to build a community, but you might find that employee that sees the source and says, I want to fix this, I want to make it better. Wouldn't it be great to have somebody come to your company who actually understood your product, wanted to use your product, and wanted to make it better? It would make hiring a lot easier. As developers, I would encourage you to, have open source projects. Play around in there. Judging by NPM and PyPy, there's a lot of people who put a lot of code out there. Feel free to do that. Participate in those communities, but I would encourage you to choose a copyleft license. One of the biggest complaints, and I skipped this earlier, I apologize, GPL specifically has a weird feature that they call it's viral. That's not a bug, that is a feature. What you're guaranteeing is that everyone is playing the same game. Rules are there to make for everybody. They're not there for one person. Rules are there to make sure the ecosystem operates. So the viral nature of the GPL ensures that people are not hijacking projects. They are not taking and not reciprocating. So I would encourage people to stick with as much copyleft as possible, with as much, keep it open, please. So developers, and people who are working inside of companies, check with management first, but explain to them and encourage them to release components of the system that in the open source domain, because those components, if they're usable to you, are probably usable to other companies. And if I see another string or linked list implementation in a piece of proprietary software ever again, I will probably go like Michael Douglas in Falling Down. I mean, we'll get a little get dark there. So I mean, code reuse is helpful. It's open. People are viewing it. People are going to look at it and say, "Oh, you made a mistake." They're going to correct it, and now everyone, benefits. So that does a little faster than I thought it'd be. So